Okay. Can y'all hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, so I'm based out of the Brunswick office of DNR Wildlife Conservation Section. I'm going to try to at least broach the topic of invasive plants in urban landscapes and how to manage them. Don't feel like you're gonna have to learn everything from this. Hopefully I'll give you some resources that you can use as a reference, maybe at least start the conversation about what invasives are in your landscape and how to sort of prioritize getting rid of them, and obviously hopefully putting natives in their place. So to start, just make sure we're on the same page about what is an invasive species. There's different definitions for it. So there's the executive order during the Clinton administration that gives a definition, and a couple other organizations within the state of Georgia that have definitions. So the Georgia Invasive Species Advisory Council, which started in 2009, the Georgia Forestry Commission, and the Georgia Exotic Pest Plant Council. But basically it's a plant, in this case, that's been introduced that's aggressive, displaces the native plants, disrupts the stability of native ecosystems and communities, often has very little or no enemies to limit its reproduction and spread. So it has a negative impact. It's not from here, and it's doesn't have a whole lot of things that are controlling it. So what can you do? Obviously know your plants, know what's native, what's not. Once you become educated, don't use them in your landscape, control them in your yard. This is the harder part, is if you are a very outgoing person and you see a local retailer selling something, it'd be great if you could talk to them about it, and encourage them to no longer sell that. Unfortunately, Georgia doesn't have a noxious weed law beyond what's listed as a federal noxious weed. So there isn't a state noxious weed list to sort of compel them on some legal level to not sell things. Volunteering would be great. We do have the Coastal Georgia Cooperative Invasive Species Management Area, which is a local invasive species alliance. You can get involved with them, and of course the Coastal Plain Chapter GNPS, volunteering with them. This is more based on animals. Don't release unwanted pets. That's definitely a vector we see for non-plant invasives, but don't release unwanted plants from your garden. Don't give out plants that aren't native in plant swaps. That could be related. If you've got boats, clean them if you're going through different waterways. We do see a potential vector for invasive insects being moved in firewood, and then report invasives if you see them. If you've not heard of it, there's a database called EdMaps. There's iPhone and Android apps that you can download, or you can do it the old-fashioned way, submitting a report to their website. So this is a little image of the EdMaps. Just open it up on your app store, search for EdMaps. Another app that's really good is an app they created out of this 2-book Forestry Service publication. It used to be available in print, which is no longer available. They turned it into an app. It's called a Field Guide for the Identification of Invasive Plants in Southern Forest. If you just go to your app store and just start typing in Southern Forest, it'll pop up. The little image you'll see will be of a kudzu vine. This is a great resource because it gives you a lot of ID pictures throughout the season. So if you're standing there in February, they might have a picture of that plant in February. There's also a little button when you open the app that gives you control information, how to control it. So if you don't memorize everything I'm talking about today, this is a great app that gives you good resources on how to control species that we're going to talk about. So definitely encourage y'all to download that one. So with the work that I do, we definitely have to use herbicides. So that's a decision you have to make on your own if you're comfortable with that. You all have to make your own decisions on what methods you want to use and what collateral effects that you're willing to accept and not accept. A lot of that can come down to timing to reduce that sort of collateral damage issue. But the 3 main herbicides we tend to use, one's called Invasive, and like, I guess like prescription drugs, they have sort of trade names that go with them. So the aquatic version of Imazicure is called Habitat, the non-aquatic is called Arsenal, and there's some off-brand names for these too. And what I've got listed here is kind of how they work. The next one is triclopyr. You might have seen Garlon 3 or Garlon 4. There's a water soluble and an oil soluble version of those two. And then glyphosate, which gets a lot of bad press. So that's up to you to decide, are you comfortable using it or not. But I did want to put a plug in for this YouTube video if you're interested in looking at some of the research that's gone into its negative effects on humans. There's a speaker out of Florida who kind of went over a lot of the research. So that's a good video to look up to kind of see if that helps inform your decision making. But each one of these, they have different ways they work. Sometimes it's seasonality. You don't want to be using some of these, like the triclopyr, the oil soluble, in really hot weather because it volatilizes. So we often do a lot of our treatments in the fall. A lot of the recommendations on the labels will tell you what temperature, what conditions you want to use it in. So there's a couple different methods that we tend to use. You can do a cut stump, which is just cutting the species if it's big enough to do that and just painting the stump. So these are methods that will really try to reduce the amount of herbicide you're putting out in the landscape. You're not getting it everywhere. If you can focus it just on the stump. And then when you're doing that, you don't need to paint the whole stump. You really just need to paint the cambium, the active tissue around the edge. And there are, I should have talked about sourcing of herbicides. So obviously I get stuff through DNR through a contract, but homeowners, you can get a lot of these same things at maybe a Tractor Supply or maybe a local hardware store. They have a lot of these counter. But anyways, back to the method. So cut stump is one. Hack and squirt, which is the pictures on the bottom left, where you're just doing a little hack into the side of the tree and you're spraying a concentrated solution of the herbicide that you're using. You do that kind of in a plane all around the tree. You're not completely girdling it, but you're leaving a space between each hack. And then there's obviously foliar. With foliar, obviously you need to look at what else is around it, because anything that gets touched by that herbicide will die. So sometimes you could do stuff seasonally at the end of the season when the native plants that you're working around have already gone dormant. So one thing you want to look at is the label of every herbicide you're using. It has all the information you need to know how to properly apply it. Like I've already said, seasonally. It also will give you information on what equipment you need to be wearing for personal protective equipment, long sleeves, pants, shoes, socks, gloves. But it will go into, is this have an eye issue? Do you really need to be careful making sure you're handling it with glasses on? And then some other safety things. What shouldn't you do afterwards? Like don't eat, don't drink, wash your hands before doing those activities. But all of these labels give information about what plants are meant for use, what rate you need to use. And so a lot of times you'll be just doing spot spraying. So you can look for spot spraying on the label and say how much percentage of the herbicide you use. The big thing here is you really need to understand what's on the label and follow it. Because if you go off label, it's illegal. So it's a legally binding thing that you need to be following the label. You'd be getting the most effective benefit from whatever you're doing. You're not wasting herbicide, they're not cheap. So you don't need to be using more. More is not more. Use what's recommended and what's been researched to work for the particular plant that you're working on. Another thing you can look at on your own is, in kind of helping you with your decision making, is relative toxicity of things. And this just kind of comes in when people start making homemade herbicides. Sometimes what you're making at home is often worse than what is sold as an herbicide. You just need to be informed on what it is you're doing. Definitely don't recommend when people add salt to things. I think there's some biblical stories of salting the earth and it creating a huge issue with being able to grow stuff. So I'd be very cautious about mixing your own homemade remedies. But again, that's your decision to make. But you can look at relative toxicity charts and see what it is you're mixing. And some of these homemade things can change the pH of your soil, and those are the kind of things you don't think about. Okay, Biocontrol is an option, not something that's often accessible to everyone, but it is something that we've used. This kind of comes in if you see them in your landscape, just inform you what they are. So if you potentially have alligator weed flea beetle or alligator weed in a pond near you, someone might have released an alligator weed flea beetle near you, and this is what they look like. They're kind of these cute little striped beetles. If you see something eating on your alligator weed, which you don't want, that's what it could be. You could also, if you know if someone has the alligator weed flea beetle on their property, you can move it to yours. It's in the state of Georgia. It's been used since the 70s. Air potato beetle is something that's been released in Brunswick and in the Kingsland St. Mary's area. So if you got air potato and you see it kind of being skeletonized, a lot of holes in it, you might have air potato beetle on it. And so the permit's been approved to release that in Georgia. So just to be aware, that might be something that's in the landscape. Water hyacinth plant hopper, I don't know that this one's really taken off. We've done a release of it, but it hasn't really worked. Some people feel very uncomfortable with biocontrol, but there is a much better vetting process now than there used to be. Okay, so I'm going to go over some of the common plants that we have in the coast that you might see popping up in your landscape. On each one, I've got on the top there you can see a P1. So that's kind of the priority level that we've created. So P1 is high priority for me. If I had to make choices, if I had Chinese tallow versus something else, I would probably spend my time on the tallow first. But each page will have basic information about the species, where it came from, some of the ecological effects, some of its life history. With a lot of our invasives, they're often reproductive and viable at a very young age. The seeds stay viable in the soil for a long time, and they stay reproductive for a long time as well. And then with tallow, it apparently does have some allelopathic abilities where it changes the soil chemistry through its leaf litter. And there was one study that looked at its effect on leopard frogs' persistence in water that has decomposing tallow foliage in it. So invasive species can have wide-ranging effects, which kind of helps reinforce the need to get rid of them. So for this species, if you're trying to manage it, depending on how bad it is, if you've just got seedlings coming up, you could manually remove them. We've pulled up moderate sized seedlings in really wet soils. I'd rather not use herbicide, so if I can pull it out and be effective, that'd be great. Cutting the species down wouldn't work without treating, because it'll just resprout from the roots. So you don't want to pull it up and leave part of this plant that could resprout. So often we'll do a hack and squirt with either triclopyr if it's in an upland situation, or imazapyr using an aquatic rated imazapyr. So that's using a little hatchet going around the stem. And we're using about a 20 or 25% solution. They do have an herbicide, which I didn't talk about, called Clearcast, which is expensive, but we've used from helicopters. I don't know that a homeowner is going to be contracting with a helicopter. Maybe you're a big landowner, but it's very selective. It doesn't hit a lot of our native trees, but you can also use this for spot spraying seedlings if you've got too many to manually remove. So another source for, and I didn't talk about this, you can use a lot of the sort of brush be gone, poison ivy killer. A lot of those have the pre-mixed triclopyr in them, so you can look at the labels for those. Those are things you can get at Home Depot or Lowe's. Forestry Suppliers also has herbicides on their website. You definitely want to make sure you know if it's an aquatic rated herbicide or not. You don't want to be using a terrestrial in an aquatic situation. And with those, the formulation is really the surfactant, which is the thing that makes the herbicide stick to the leaves. That's what's really changing. The active ingredient of the herbicide is the same thing. It's just the additives that they've added to it on the aquatics are safer for aquatic species. You still need to follow the label, but you don't want to use an upland herbicide in an aquatic situation because there could be negative effects on aquatic life. And so this Chinese tallow we often treat in the fall, towards the end of the season, because we're using triclopyr. It seems to work better in the fall because you don't have, in the spring, you don't want to do a treatment because you've got so much sap flowing that it basically dilutes the herbicide that you're applying to it. And if anyone has experience with any of these species and has a certain method that's worked for them, I would say put that in the chat. I've used certain methods that I just have gotten comfortable with. So if anyone else has something else they've done, feel free to share that. China berry, very similar methods with Chinese tallow. A lot of our invasive trees, I kind of do the same thing. Treatment using the hack and squirt method. You can do cut stump with these. It sometimes seems like, and others might have different experience, that a cut stump is more dramatic and the trees shut down quickly and you might not be able to get the herbicide in quickly. Timing of treatment is important. You want to do it within a minute oftentimes before the cells of the plants close up. It just seems like the hack and squirt method, the trees are more just wounded so they don't shut down completely and you might get more translocation of the herbicide that way. And I'm not going to talk a lot about the trees. Hopefully the descriptions are enough. And I think we should probably know a lot of these already, but I'm happy to take questions about them after. Calorie pear, this is a newer invasive. For years it was just a sterile tree that smelled like fish and broke apart in 20 years. I never felt it was a very good ornamental, but over time the sterility thing has gone out the window and it's able to produce seed. And create this very thorny version of a calorie pear, which creates thickets and can be a huge issue. I've not actually had to deal with this one myself, but hack and squirt should work. There's also, you can also do the oil version of triclopyr in a basil bark oil. Sometimes on seedlings with thin bark, you can just, basically you're painting the lower part of the trunk with this triclopyr herbicide in an oil carrier. It's a basil bark oil, so it soaks through the bark. Once the bark on some of these trees gets too thick, that method doesn't work. But it might be a quicker method where you just got a backpack sprayer and you're just going through and painting. You're not having to bend over and hack something. So those are considerations to think about. How old is the tree? What kind of effort can you put into it? Can you just apply the herbicide to the trunk and let it soak in? In some situations, that might just be quicker. White mulberry, very similar method. Hack and squirt. You can try cut stump again. Sometimes you need to do cut stump if you need to get the tree out of the location. So maybe a standing dead tree that dies slowly is not really going to work for you. So if that's the situation, maybe cutting the thing down and then treating it as quickly as possible might be what you need to do. Oftentimes I'm working in the woods. I'm probably not coming back there and I'm okay with the tree standing dead, but if it's in your front yard, you might want it to just completely come down and then treat it. So we have various privets, Chinese, Japanese, glossy. Right here on the coast where I am, we tend to see glossy privet more than the Chinese privet, which is a huge problem for most of the state, but for whatever reason, we don't have as much on the coast, really close to the coast where I'm at. So this one you can do a cut stump on the shrubs, cut them all down and paint those stumps, or you could do a hack and squirt if they've got really large trunks. The glossy privet on the coast is kind of tree-like, so that's what we do if the trees are too big. You can do a foliar. With some invasives, they tend to keep their leaves on longer than our natives, and this is one where folks have done foliar on, especially the Chinese privet, when all the natives, especially spring ephemerals, have already gone dormant, and you can have less collateral damage with glyphosate. So glyphosate doesn't have soil activity. It's not going to stick around. Triclopyr can have some soil activity. And imazapyr, the other herbicide I've talked about, has quite a bit of soil activity. So those are things you need to consider when choosing your herbicide, which level of soil activity is acceptable or not. If you've got sensitive things that are dormant, you would definitely want to move towards something that has little or no soil activity. Coral rhodesia, this one's definitely popping up on the coast. I don't know how far inland people are seeing it. It's a sort of a lower shrub, has crenated margins, kind of like a pie crust, and kind of under the top layer of leaves, you have this dangling clusters of showy red berries. I guess it was popular as an ornamental, but it can really take over kind of moist soil areas. It's a big problem in Florida. So this is just one to look out for. I've seen it since it's growing in moist soils. I often just pull it up, but it does produce a lot of seeds that are moved by birds. So you kind of have to keep a lookout for this one. I don't think you would do hack and squirt on this one. I think you could, if the shrubs are really big, I think you would just do a cut stump, just cut it and paint it. They really don't get that big. Big leaf lantana, I see this a lot in sort of old town areas in Brunswick where I live. You can get into the dunes. It seems to like shell, so we've got a lot of areas with shell accumulations out here. So we've been doing a lot of cut stump with 40% glyphosate, and you can do foliar 1 to 2%, most are at 1%. But then again, you need to look at what your collateral damage is going to be. So it's a lot easier just to do a cut stump and paint it with glyphosate is what we're doing. Thorny olive, this is another large shrub. I would do cut stump on this one with triclopyr. You could do a 2% foliar, but it's a large shrub. It's probably better to get that bulk out of there. Heavenly bamboo, manually remove it, or you could do a cut stump like the other things. Imazapyr, 20% glyphosate. This one has seeds that have cyanide in it, so we want it out. Kogan grass, good news on this one, just call Georgia Forestry Commission and they will come and treat it for you. This is what I just put in there for you to look out for. It could get spread by mowers or timber operations. What you're going to look out for this one is in the spring. If you have a grass blooming in the spring, that's not usually when grasses bloom. Very fluffy white panicle, February to June. You want to look out for that. Take a closer look at this one. The mid-center of the vein is off center. So that's one way you can tell, and it has very sharp edges. Golden bamboo, I've not had to treat this one much, but there's various ways where you can cut the stump and then basically or 20% glyphosate in the little cup that's created, or you can let this one regrow to 3 to 4 feet and do a foliar treatment with glyphosate or imazapyr. So it's a pretty high rate of glyphosate, 10%. And you want to have a good surfactant on it to make sure it sticks. Thankfully, I haven't had to work with this one myself on the properties that we work with. Asparagus fern, we get this one a lot, kind of showing up in our dunes. I'm not sure that inland this one really shows up as a very bad invasive, but something in dunes, probably through birds. You can just dig it up or just spray it with a 1 or 2% glyphosate. Climbing fern, so this is one where you're going to have to treat it repeatedly with a 4% glyphosate. Some others might have some other methods that are more effective. You definitely want to try to treat it before peak spore activity, because you don't want to be going into a site treating it, getting the spores on your person, and then spreading to other areas. So you want to treat this in the growing season before September. Wisteria, this is one I would treat much like our other invasive trees. You can do a hack and squirt or a cut stump with imazapyr triclopyr. And then plant the native wisteria instead. It's prettier. Honeysuckle, often with this one, we do a lot of manual removal. It's kind of hard to do a hack and squirt unless it's really big stems. Oftentimes you could do a cut stump and just paint that little stem, or do a foliar because it's probably taken over everything in its location. 1 to 2% glyphosate. You can try doing it later in the season again when most other things have maybe gone Air potato, this is one where we've got a biocontrol out there for it. You can also do a foliar with triclopyr, or if the stems are large enough, you can use a triclopyr on that. English ivy, thankfully I don't have to deal with this one very much, but you can often just manually remove it. You definitely want to get it out of your trees. Cut it up a couple feet from the base of the tree and let it die off in the tree. If it's creating a ground cover, you can do a foliar with triclopyr. You can also just get the poison ivy, English ivy killer at your Home Depot or Lowe's and use that. You definitely want to have a good surfactant to kind of stick to the leaves because they're pretty waxy. You don't want the roadside to just roll right off. If they are pretty large stems, you can do a cut stem treatment on. I think I'm almost done. This is one that I'm seeing pop up. I'm just putting it in here more often in coastal Georgia. It looks similar to our native Virgensbauer. The difference being this one, the leaflets aren't toothed at all. The native has little teeth on it. So this is one I would, if you see it popping up in your yard, just dig it out. Probably going to take a foliar treatment to get it out, 2% triclopyr glyphosate. Okay, I didn't want to take up too much time from the other speakers, but that's kind of an overview. And again, there are resources out there to kind of look into to find recommendations that you might have.
Well, thank you, Eamon. We have a question in the chat. Heather asked, who created the categories of the—
Oh, that's a good question.
P1.
So the Coastal Georgia SISMA, the Cooperative Invasive Species Management Area. So we took the state list that had been made by the Georgia Exotic Pest Plant Council and the Georgia Invasive Advisory Committee. They both have their own invasive species list. And we took those were based for statewide, and we kind of reordered them based off of our priorities on the coast. So certain things dropped out. And some of those priorities, we did those back in like 2012. I think we updated in 2017. So they could have even shifted since they were originally made. So that's kind of what they're based off of is how much time as land managers we were spending on those species and how much threat that we felt that they proposed. So it wasn't as scientifically rigorous. It was based off of other lists and our own thoughts on it.
Okay. I see another comment that, let's see, Aaron downloaded the app. Is that the EDD app you're talking about? Yes, that's it. Marilyn would like to share this with her